Hi everyone. I want to talk a little bit about Magobe Ramosa's book, African Philosophy Through Ubuntu, or at least the sections that I had you read. That book is actually this one here, and there's more to it. I guess there's a total of like 207 pages, and so I did not give you the whole thing. Obviously, you had other things to read this week as well. So, I think with Ramose, what I'm trying to do here is give you, I guess you could say, non-Western kind of parallels or responses or alternatives, I don't know what word we want to use here, to the kinds of storyline that I'm trying to tell with the Western thinkers. And this week we talked a little bit about Hobbes, John Stuart Mill, and Marx. And these figures are all giving us a sense of, the three core concepts in our class. They're really telling us something about social organization, especially. What does the world look like, and out of that, how is an ethical life possible, or what does ethics look like within those spaces? And so, Ramose, who is a South African philosopher, still alive today, he's retired now. He is one of the major proponents of this concept of Ubuntu. If you're a programmer, you might recognize the word Ubuntu as being a Linux, a flavor of Linux, a kind of way of or installation of Linux. And so they got that word from this African concept, or this African idea, sometimes expressed as I am because we are. And what Ramose does here, I think, is he gives us a more sophisticated idea of Ubuntu. Quite often it's been seen as a kind of alternative to Western ethics, alternative to Western political thought, political theory. Often Africans have been asked or even required to show what's truly African about their philosophical ideas. And so things like Ubuntu have been used as a response to that challenge, right? And I think Ramose is giving us something a little more sophisticated than that. I can't say I agree with everything he says or does in this, but I think a lot of what he does is really quite interesting and kind of takes a different direction from a lot of Western epistemological and ethical and social theory kind of thought. So what Ramose is trying to do with the notion of Ubuntu is to try and make it more than just a philosophical position or a theory or an opinion about the world. He's trying to say that this is the basis for philosophy itself. And really, as you read his whole book, it's not just African philosophy, although that's what he focuses on. It's really, philosophy itself. And the way he does this is to think about the kind of constituent parts of the word Ubuntu, which is a Bantu word which is found in many Bantu languages across Africa. So Ubu and Untu. So that combination, Ramose argues, is a combination that really puts together what we could think of as being and becoming. Okay, so these are kind of classic categories within Western metaphysics, or really philosophical metaphysics. The idea that there's a kind of tension, I suppose, or the question of pride of place of being and becoming. So which is it that we focus on? Do we focus on what exists, what is, first? Right? This is all very abstract stuff, I know, but I think it's going to, come into focus in a moment. Do we focus on what exists, or do we focus on the idea that everything changes? Okay, so if you look in ancient philosophy, last week we looked at Plato and Aristotle. Plato's a classic figure who focuses on being first, and he gets that from people like Parmenides. What he wants to say is that, there's a lot of the world is shifting and changing and all of that, but what we have to do is think about what is true, which is what is eternal, which is what is really real, okay? And once we get at that, then all of the rest of that kind of shifting, changing stuff is going to fall away, and and we're going to realize just what things really are, and we can focus on that, and that's where ethics lies. We will understand what the good is. That's where social organization lies. Remember, with Plato, there was that notion of the state as being well ordered, with the philosopher at the top, because the philosopher is the one who knows what being is. So there's that whole stream, that whole tendency within thought to prioritize being over becoming. But then there are those who think about becoming as being more fundamental. So Heraclitus in ancient Greek philosophy is an example of this. He's the guy who said that the world is always in flux. You can never step into the same river twice because the river changes. He wanted to focus on the idea that everything is always becoming something else. There's nothing that we can really put our finger on that is really reliable through all of that. And so our job, because of that, is to try and figure out how we live in this ever-changing world. And so there have been other figures through history who have tried to, tried to make the same kind of case. And more importantly, there are those who have tried to kind of relate these two things together. Most thinkers probably put one over the other, right? Being is important, becoming is just illusion or is secondary or whatever. Sometimes they will admit, yeah, we need some becoming, we need change. We recognize that change happens. But what we really have to focus on is what is permanent. You have figures like Hegel, okay, in the late 18th, early 19th century. Hegel's somebody who says what we need is a kind of dialectical relationship between these two things. So yes, we need a kind of idea of being, but that's always in flux. That's always overcoming itself. What happens is we have a state of the world, and we start to see the kind of, over time, we start to see the fissures and the kind of the ways that state of the world doesn't work, and it gets to a point where it has to flip over, change over into something else. And so there's these periods of stability, and there's these periods of crisis or change. I mean, you can see a little bit of Marx in this, right? I mean, Marx is saying a very similar thing to Hegel, at least at that point, right? We have these ideas of the economic order of the world. So right now we're in the capitalist system, and Marx says what we're going to need is a revolution, right? And that revolution is going to flip us over, change us over. So there is a moment of becoming, there's a moment of change, even though there's also moments of being, or stability, if you wish. What does Ramose do? Well, Ramose is quite unusual, I guess, in that he wants to put these two things together as equals. You find very few philosophers that try and do that, mostly because it's hard to imagine what that would actually look like. But he wants to further make the claim that this is African life. This is, if we're looking for a way to describe what African life is about, it is the equal acceptance of both being and becoming. He uses metaphors like music for all of this. And for him, the notion of putting together being and becoming, he kind of uses this notion of the Rio mode, which is he gets from the physicist and philosopher David Bohm. And the Rio mode really refocuses everything on the question that we're asking, right? So everything about life is about questioning. How, what does it mean to live? What does it mean to be who we are? What does it mean to be African? What does it mean to be, live in Florida? What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be any of these things? And then we attempt to answer those questions. And so the metaphors that Ramose uses are metaphors like musicality. He wants to see the answers to those questions as being something like, something like jazz, something like, a rhythmic beat of African music, and something that you dance to, right? He's very clear that this is not just something we sit back and, cross our arms and, listen to a symphony or listen to listen to an album from start to finish and don't get involved. I mean, for him, music is always about being involved. And so he's trying to present this notion of Ubuntu to us as really overcoming the separation between us and the world. We are participating in the world. And so, all of the rest of the concepts of our course kind of flow out of that, right? What does it mean to be ethical under those conditions? Well, it's not going to mean coming up with abstract ideas about what the good is. It's going to be about engaging with what it means to be human, right? And figuring out how we develop that humanity, how we accentuate that humanity. How are we going to build, a social world? Well, the institutions that we build are going to be predicated on that idea as well, right? I mean, that idea that it's not just about kind of managing things as if society was a big machine. Again, we are human beings that, every one of us matter, but we also matter because we are in a community, right? So that's where the I am because we are idea comes in. It's not a kind of repudiation of individualism, exactly. It's an acceptance or bringing in of the idea that no individual is an individual without the community in which they find themselves. So the other chapter from this book I gave you is his chapter on globalization. And the reason I gave you that was to kind of get you thinking about how he is going to apply this, I guess what we could think of as a fairly traditional African notion, to a very modern sort of set of questions, right? Because we might think, in African philosophy, well, this is all really for a kind of traditional a view of the world. It's not really going to be applicable to anything we have in modern society. And, Ramose is really going to resist that idea. He's going to take a run at a modern economic system, and if you take seriously what I just said about Ubuntu in general, it's going to be pretty clear that an economic system predicated on simply the amassing of wealth, the developing of wealth, the exchange over borders across the world, all of that sort of thing, he's not going to be interested in that sort of thing. He's going to think that that's a distraction from what it means to be human. And so in that sense, he is going to kind of follow a fairly traditional critique of, kind of what he calls economic fundamentalism, or kind of that radical capitalist sort of notion that it's simply about, development as raising the incomes of individuals and then letting them go off and do whatever it is they want. That's not yet going to be the development of the human as human, right? It's going to simply be the development of an economic system. Interestingly, he's also going to talk about the idea of the family, and that might seem like it doesn't really fit all that well, but he's going to get this from his discussion of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so what he's going to try and do, I think, is to think about that declaration as essentially a Western document, and not only a Western document, but a document that has its foundations within this kind of global capitalism that he finds so problematic. And so what ends up happening in this declaration, he thinks, is a kind of instantiation of a picture of what it means to be human that really does not apply to many humans, especially not Africans. Okay, and so the thing he takes the focus on is structures of family, particularly monogamous marriage. And what I think he has in mind in the back of his head are a couple of things. Number one, the fact that until fairly recently, and even in some places still, polygamous marriage is part of African society. Number two, there is a lot of discussion of extended families, and families that are extended not only in terms of, cousins and so forth, but extended temporally, I guess. So yes, elderly people, but even ancestors, right? So even dead people. Right? And so, I mean, what sense does that make, we might think? Well, for an African, in the African sense, there is a sense that there is a body of knowledge that is instantiated in the honored elders and in the honored, the ones who have passed away. He also focuses on the not yet here, in other words, children not yet born. And so there is a sense that there is a kind of idea of what it means to be human in a larger community for him that is not well reflected in this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, Declaration of Human Rights is essentially a kind of Western liberal document where certain rights accrue to us as individuals. And that's the kind of thing that he's going to resist. That kind of undermines any notion of Ubuntu because, no longer are we embedded within a community or a world. So we have a couple of things, and he thinks all of that comes about because of this, addiction to wealth generation and global capitalism and things of that nature. And so, he gets to, discussions of human rights that it looks at times as if he is resisting the idea of human rights at all, and he's not really doing that. He wants to reposition human rights. I mean, it would be strange for someone like him to say, human rights, we don't want those, because, the human rights talk has been quite powerful in pushing back against some real serious injustices within the African continent, right? Including South Africa, where he's located. And so, so there's a certain sense in which we want to talk about human rights, but what we don't want is to make those into kind of abstract ideals, which are floating outside of human experience itself. And so he talks about, the way he puts it is, to be human is to affirm one's humanity by recognizing the humanity of others, and on that basis, establish humane, respectful relations with them. Okay, so there is a certain kind of extension of the family model in a certain sense to those who are beyond the immediate family space. On page 193, 194, he talks about a couple of aphorisms, one of which he translates as the individual human being is the subject and not an object of intrinsic value in its own right. And so, in other words, we can't simply accrue, kind of properties to humans like rights. We are subjects. We are, in other words, creators of things. This goes back to his definition of Ubuntu earlier, where there's a certain sense of becoming. If you can't become, if you can't emerge into something new, then there's no sense in which we can really say your human rights have been defended, right? You may have the right to, travel, the right to not be persecuted, the right to this, that, and the other thing. But we're not yet at the point of asking, what does it mean to flourish? What does it mean to thrive? And so the other aphorism he talks about is one where he says, if and when one is faced with a decisive choice between wealth and the preservation of life of another human being, one should opt for the preservation of life, right? So very clear kind of statement against this notion of externalizing value to something that can be enumerated. So when we think about wealth, I mean, he's taking explicit aim at money, but we could see that as a broader sort of thing as well. That the externalization of our value as if they're properties of us in some sense. So what Ramose is doing here, I think, is trying to give us a picture of, an ethic and an epistemology that is, he is arguing is fundamentally based in our reality, in African reality, but is extensible to human reality in general. I think if you pushed him on this, he would simply think that the West has largely forgotten this, and so in that sense, Africa has to be the bearer of a certain form of understanding what it means to be human that the West has forgotten. And so this is a different kind of ethics, right? This is a kind of ethics that's about flourishing, it's about thriving, it's about being in a community. It's not about, asking what would you do in this particular paradoxical situation, or, what is the general principle of action that you should apply to all of these specific instances, or something like that. So that's kind of why I wanted you to read some Ramose. I wanted you to see, a pretty important African philosopher kind of thinking through some of the parallel issues that we have in this course. You may well be able to see some echoes off of some of the figures we're reading this week, especially Hobbes and Mill, who really are carrying forward that notion of liberal society. And it's worth asking how much or how close someone like Ramose is going to get to someone like Marx. Because of the readings this week, he would be the closest, I would say. But, the more you look at this, the more it doesn't necessarily, look like Marx either. So that'd be an interesting question. What is he picking up? I mean, they both have a critique of capitalism, but what do their answers look like? How do their answers compare? Anyway, hope you're having fun with these readings, and I look forward to what shows up in the discussion area.